Good morning. For over 5 years, investors and business managers outside Asia have seen stories like these here about how Vietnam is replacing China in the world's supply chains. These reports are typical. There are hundreds of them from over the past decade. Vietnam exports boom as China's shipments to U.S. fall. Vietnam is a big beneficiary of the U.S.-China trade war. Vietnam's economy is booming. But business managers and executives who are actually responsible for managing supply chains and moving them around, closing a factory in one country and opening one in another, have always been concerned that the neighboring countries of China have a low floor and a low ceiling. This is a metaphor for a country that is quite underdeveloped with a large population, and so the first movers, the first investors can benefit from the rapid development that's going to soon happen there. But it also has a low ceiling. Excess labor becomes absorbed pretty quickly. There's a war for talent that develops almost right away for people there who can speak English, for example, or have a college degree. Land prices go up, slowly at first, but then suddenly, especially in any areas that are served by roads and utilities. Even delivery times get extended because your trucks are now sharing roadways with hundreds of new companies that are moving in. And that's what's happening in Vietnam now, as producers who opened up in Vietnam are hitting this ceiling, the limits of what was ever possible there. Against this background, it's good to remember too, that the primary reason for many companies going to Vietnam in the first place was to avoid the U.S. tariffs that were being put on from Chinese-produced goods. The tariff on most of those products is 25%. So now it becomes a solvable math problem for corporate decision makers. Moving part of a supply or manufacturing chain to Vietnam from China requires at least a 25% savings, or they won't even consider it. And it has to be a durable saving stream. It has to be persistent, that extends across the entire recovery period for the initial investments. We'll lead off here from Bloomberg and the New York Times. Chinese exports are booming again. China's trade surplus, exports minus imports, hit a record last month, $99 billion. China's trade surplus just with the United States was $32 billion, which was a 10% increase over last year. China's surplus with the EU was up more than 10% year on year to over $22 billion. This chart from Bloomberg shows where China's trade surpluses are coming from by region. And when we hear CEOs and spokespersons for companies go on TV and say they're moving supply chains from China, they're not. They need us to keep buying their products, and they know we want to hear that they are nearshoring or reshoring or friendshoring, getting products from places outside China, but they're not. Otherwise, these charts would be different. They tell investors that they are building resilience in their supply chains by moving production to third-party countries outside China. But they're not really doing that either, not anymore, because the companies that did relocate some production to Vietnam, for example, are facing much higher costs than before. There's a good review here in Chevron. This is the Chinese power tools company. They produce 1.5 million tools annually. They set up in Vietnam to avoid the tariffs. So like we said, this is a math problem for them. The tariff is 25% for anything out of Nanjing. So all their investments and costs and future cost increases need to be under that 25% number. Otherwise, they'll just keep everything in Nanjing and pay the tariff. But their costs are going up, and they're making less than they thought. Raw materials prices are up 10%. By the way, raw materials costs are falling in China for almost everything. But in Vietnam, they're going up. Overall, his costs are up 7%, and the supply chain is slower and less responsive than in China. He's thinking Vietnam is not the solution that it maybe once was. Taiwan companies are thinking the same thing. Taiwanese investors are just looking to survive, is what the Taiwan-Vietnam Chamber of Commerce says. So these cost increases in Vietnam, which are now across the board, illustrate the low ceiling problem. Inflation is going up in Vietnam, and there are infrastructure problems there too. New firms in Vietnam are pushing prices up, and that's hurting the new firms as well as the old ones. Increases in labor prices, especially on the retention side. When new companies come in, they look to hire and take talent away from the companies that have already been established there. Land use costs are going up. Over 4 years, rents are up 7% year on year in the north, 13% in the south. Rule of 72 here says that rent costs in North Vietnam will double in about 10 years, and in the south in about 5.5 years. Vietnam's supply chain is now another major challenge. Nobody can compete with China on supply chain. So most companies still need to source components and parts from China anyway and ship them to Vietnam. This right there adds shipping costs, obviously, as well as brokerage fees and intermediate tariffs. In this case, supply chain managers are not diversifying supply chains away from China. They're just multiplying the complexity inside the same chain without adding anything. Going back to the labor situation, and it's not hard to see why Vietnam was considered so attractive based on their population. And it's also true that Vietnam's ceiling is higher than most of the other countries neighboring China. The population of Vietnam is just under 100 million people. That's a third, again, larger than the population of the UK. It's bigger than Germany. It's a lot more than Thailand, which is here in Southeast Asia, next door to Vietnam. But Vietnam has fewer people than Shandong province, where I am right now. It's about the same as Henan, next door. So for supply chain executives who really know the numbers and who understand that there are hard limits, and that those limits are bound by how quickly excess labor, in Vietnam in this case, can be absorbed into the workforce at higher cost, and they're bound again by the 25% tariff rate. Now Vietnam is at those limits. This guy at Incorp says Vietnam investors are hitting the limits of what is possible there. Here's the founder of a company that makes straws. Their costs are much higher compared to China. Land prices are several times higher, not the percentage in other words, but multiples. Looking across the world, he can't find many places cheaper than China. China's industrial chain advantages just make everyone else non-competitive in comparison. These charts are monthly. $100 billion for the month of June is more than $3 billion a day. That's China's manufactured goods surplus with the rest of the world. When we look at these charts, one thing that jumps out is the big dip in 2020 when the supply chains got all screwy because of COVID. Can you show me on these charts where the trade war happened? All the big tariffs and trade sanctions that are intended to reduce China's share of global manufacturing. Can you show me where that is on these charts here? There are lots of jiggles up and down, but the trend is clear. China's trade surpluses are growing, not shrinking. And if offloading Chinese factories to Vietnam were still a winning formula, the Vietnam-Taiwan Chamber of Commerce would be saying so. That's their only job, to promote investment in Vietnam and to promote their own companies that are there. But they're saying it's played out. Highest trade surplus ever. This is Hong Kong. Be good.
Great evangelist who will turn his co-workers